Hey, Joy family, happy Thursday. It is great to come to you again this morning, this beautiful morning, and with a word of encouragement for you from God's Word. So before we jump into our next miracle of Jesus that we've been looking at, want to remind you a couple things coming up. First of all, tonight our Ladies Through the Bible in a Year study is going to be meeting 7 o'clock over at Rosellan's. So you'll want to make sure you take note of that, ladies. All ladies are invited to that. There's information on our website, on our Facebook page, so you can check that out. Also, this Sunday, we're having our service, again, our time of worship together, both in person and via our live stream, so you can join us one of those ways. If you do decide to join us in person, please just check out on our website some of the guidelines we have for health and safety of attending a service here at Joy in person during this time of this pandemic. That's just kind of crazy right now, but that we would love to have you join us either in person or live stream. We're in Romans chapter 14 this week, talking about how this life that's unleashed because of the gospel changes the way we treat each other, especially other believers. So we're going to look at that this week in our study. But this morning, we're going to look at more miracles of Jesus. And these are some of my favorites. So we're not looking at all the miracles of Jesus. Actually, the miracle that we look at today happened right after another major miracle of Jesus that we're not really going to touch on, but it's the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And most of us know that miracle where he's teaching them along the sea, and it got late in the day, and then he feeds them with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So we kind of have that one, right? Now, this miracle happens right after this event. And it's actually included in 3 of the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and John. Matthew is the only one who has this second part to the miracle on it that most of us are familiar with. So we're going to read Matthew's account, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what this miracle means for us. And more importantly, what this miracle teaches us about Jesus. And that's kind of how we've been looking at some of these miracles. So it's found in Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 22. And it says, immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Now, imagine this. Imagine walking on water. And a lot of times we talk about that. Well, you're not Jesus. You can't walk on water. Or who does he think he is, that he can walk on water? And we talk about this and we kind of throw it around. But this is where it comes from this miracle where Jesus comes walking on water, which is impossible, right? Another miracle that's just supernatural and impossible. And a lot of times when we look at this miracle, we look at this account that includes Peter. Now, Mark's account and John's account don't include Peter walking on the water. But a lot of times we look at this miracle and we learn lessons about our own faith, right? We learn lessons about how Peter was courageous and he got out of the boat, or we say, well, don't be like the disciples who didn't leap out in faith. Be like Peter who leaped out in faith. But then they say, but don't be like Peter who looked at the winds around him, took his eyes off of Jesus and began to sink. And all of those are great lessons. I'm not saying those aren't great lessons, but there's something else in this miracle that teaches us about Jesus and about who Jesus is for us as we live our lives that I want to focus on. Most of us have heard the stories about our faith and doubt and things, about Peter's and from that perspective. But I want to kind of show it from the perspective of Jesus and our lives and what we can learn about Jesus for our lives today. So first of all, here's one of the interesting things in this miracle. First, it's right after the feeding of the 5,000, which is a huge miracle, and everybody's in awe, and even the disciples are in awe. And in the midst of this high note, what does Jesus do? Jesus goes to a mountain to pray. He takes time to seek his Father, which is really cool. That in this height of his popularity and this height of his influence, Jesus takes time out of his, out of all of this to go and to seek God. But something happens right before it. It says Jesus sent the disciples, told them to get in the boat, and he sent them on their way, right? It says he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side of the lake. And this is one thing we learn about Jesus. And while they're out there, they go against these storms, right? It says the waves are buffeting them, and they weren't making any headway. So this wasn't a storm where their lives were in danger, but they weren't going anywhere. They were floundering. So they were facing a storm. And I don't know if you've ever faced storms in life where you go and you're floundering. Well, and we face these things and we're just slogging it away in our lives. And we're just like, man, I can't seem to make any headway. I can't seem to, every time I start to feel like we're going somewhere, even with my relationship with Jesus, life kind of hits me and I kind of slow down. And what is with that? Well, the first thing we learn in this is that Jesus is the one who sent them there. Sometimes God sends us out into life to face difficult situations. Sometimes God sends us out into life where we're going to not always have an easy go of things. And why does he do that? Well, one reason why he does that is to strengthen our faith. Another reason why he does this is maybe for other people, because they need to see us going through things, and then they see us going through these things with Jesus, and they learn from that. So there's many different reasons, but we see in this miracle, Jesus sends them out into this situation. Now, it's the middle of the night. Actually, it's almost dawn, which is the darkest time. I don't know if you've ever woken up before dawn or been up all night. One of the hardest times is if you stay up all night to stay awake is like from 4 o'clock on, before the dawn hits, because A, it's usually coldest, B, it's usually like you're starting to get the most tired, you're at your weakest and all of these things. Well, at this time, when all is darkest, Jesus comes walking to them, right? And he comes walking on the sea, and Mark actually says he was going to go past them, but they see Jesus and they think it's a ghost, so they don't even recognize Jesus, as oh, here comes Jesus. Wow. Well, I wonder why, because nobody walked on water before, right? But anyway, they see this and they think it's, and Jesus speaks into their storm, doesn't he? He says, "Take heart, it's I. Do not be afraid." And I want to get right back to that, but there's something else that happens in the account of Peter, right? Because then Peter says, all right, if it's really you, tell me to come out and walk to you. And he says, come, right? So we look at that. And sometimes when we're in storms of life, we can be like Peter and we can have a lot of faith. And we said, yeah, I'm going to follow Jesus. But sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're like the disciples, the rest of the disciples who stayed in the boat and said, wow, that was really cool, Jesus. And, all right, I see you. But we don't necessarily have this heroic faith like that. And that's okay. Jesus never condemns the rest of the disciples for not getting out of the boat or anything like that, right? And Peter gets out of the boat and he starts walking to Jesus, and we hear, he looks at the wind. He notices everything else around him, and he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he begins to sink. But there's something very interesting when he begins to sink. What happens? Jesus reaches out his hand. Isn't that cool? It didn't say that Peter reached out his hand. Peter was probably flailing, going, I'm going to sink, right? But Jesus reaches out his hand and grabs him. And this is the second thing that we learn about Jesus, is Jesus comes to us in these storms of life, in these times where we think we're in a situation where we feel all alone or we feel like we're not going anywhere in our life. Guess what? Jesus comes to us and he's there for us. Even in times where we don't sense him or we don't reach out to him, he's still there for us. He was there for the rest of the disciples in the boat just as much as he was for Peter. And he came to them and he calmed the storm, didn't he? He calmed what was happening in them. Why? Because he came to us. So Jesus is telling us, you know what? In this life, you're going to face troubles. In fact, he tells his disciples things, right? And then he says, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And when Jesus says that, this is an example of this miracle of Jesus. He says, you're going to face troubles. You're going to go into these situations, and don't be afraid to go into them. Sometimes I'm going to take you into them. But take heart, because I've overcome all of this. I'm there, right there with you. So I want you to be encouraged this morning in this miracle of Jesus, that he comes to his disciples when they feel like they're floundering. Jesus comes walking on water, doing the impossible, and to remind his disciples, to remind his followers, I'm there with you. Take heart. Do not be afraid. I am with you. So be encouraged today, wherever you are. Maybe you're feeling like you're all alone, or you're kind of in one of those situations where you're in a storm. You don't seem to be making any headway, and you're like, man, this stinks. Why would God not care about me? He does care about you right where you are, and he's right with you. And all he's calling you to do is do not be afraid, or just trust in me, even through this, because I will do amazing things in and through your life. And that's what Jesus is reminding us here in his personhood, that Jesus is one who is always with us and for us. So be encouraged by this word today, and I'll be coming to you with another miracle on Tuesday, but join us Sunday, 10 a.m. for our time of worship together. Have a great rest of the week, Joy family.